Or obviously, there is no better approach here. Okay, I'm not saying server side is best and client sucks. Right? There's advantages and disadvantages. Let's start with the client. What's the advantages with the client side server? If I have a client side server, okay, what I will minimize the overhead on the server side, if you think about it, right? Because I'm going to execute everything. The client takes uh, the the memory allocation and the execution, right? They're transferring the results, okay, and the client is now responsible of this cursor, right? The server has nothing. Essentially, it serves the connection, and the cursor is closed, right? However, okay, there are the disadvantage of this is if if you execute client-side cursors, what happens is the network bandwidth of the network is huge. If you're pulling a lot of rows, like in this example, obviously it's a bad practice to do so. But if you do that, then you'll end up with a lot of network. You can saturate your network bandwidth, right? Essentially, okay, your bandwidth, and another disadvantage is your client might not have that much memory to process this stuff. Okay, so advantages and disadvantages, right? It's client, so but the server is now relieved of this, right? The good thing about server side cursor, which is this one, the server side cursors is what you're gonna do is you execute the server side, and you can see that it's the client is relieved, right? So you put the overhead on the server versus the client. So the server is now doing more work. The server is keeping hold of these cursors. And imagine hundreds of thousands of clients doing the same thing, opening all these server cursors, and the worst of all, leaking those cursors. Oh my God, right? Your database, you can endanger the database, right? Of just overflowing the database because hey, so it's like you leaving all these cursors and leaking all of them, okay? But you an advantage if you're using them very moderately and in a smart way, you can uh, you can you can actually benefit from server side cursors, right? So it's like, hey, I'm processing like a million rows. Let me process 1,000 rows as a result. Do something with it, like do a map reduce, for example, and do something with an ETL it to something else, right? And then server side cursors are great for that. If one processing 1 million results or whatever, and then doing something with it, and then fetching 50 rows at a time and doing something with it and exiting, right? But if you shouldn't really use it all the time, especially if the applications like you don't just create server-side cursors for the fun of it, right? Because you might leak, and leaking can be dangerous, guys. All right, I think that's the difference as between server-side and client-side. Obviously, there are advantages and disadvantages for both, right? Obviously, you can stay with client-side cursors, but you have to be very careful when you're querying. Never do this. Never select all. Obviously, that's a bad thing. Never do an unbounded query like we're doing here. You're gonna do a where clause. Okay. Always, you can essentially simulate a server side cursor by doing I think it's called limit, right? Give me the first 10 results, right? And if you do a server side cursor, remember this is a completely stateful operation, right? So you can't really use it well in a web environment. You cannot just do a service that creates a server side cursor. Like you cannot build it in a stateless manner. Okay, so I really prefer the personally, if you ask me, I prefer client side cursor, and you have to be very, very diligent to do what you're doing. All right, guys. With that said, that's all for me today. Hope you enjoyed this video. With that said, guys, stay awesome. I'm gonna see you in the next one, guys. Goodbye.